At 9:18 p.m. on Friday, January 9th, 2026, in the cold blue glow of a late-night phone screen, a name that once rode in on weekly primetime television, Roger Lawrence Ewing, the clean-cut young deputy audiences knew as Thad Greenwood on Gunsmoke, reappeared in the smallest possible way, not in a spotlight, not in a studio, not to a roar of applause, but as a quiet obituary line confirming that he had died on December 18th, 2025, in Morro Bay, California, 83 years old, his cause of death undisclosed, his exit arriving to the public weeks after the moment.
Long before the obituary line, long before Morro Bay and the quiet weeks between December 18th and the night the news finally traveled, Roger Lawrence Ewing was a young man stepping into the machinery of American television at the moment it could turn a familiar face into a household presence almost overnight, when living rooms across the country arranged themselves around a single glowing screen, when a theme song could feel like a national heartbeat, and when a western town called Dodge City, built from painted storefronts, dust, and studio light, could feel more real to viewers than their own streets. Gunsmoke was not just a show. It was a ritual, a 20-season marathon that ran for 2 decades, a weekly return to a world where right and wrong were argued with boots on wooden floors and the law wore a badge under harsh, bright lamps. And when Roger Ewing arrived in that orbit in 1965, first in a different role and then as Thad Greenwood, he arrived inside a machine that had already trained America to look for the same faces, the same voices, the same comfort, at the same hour on the same night, as if familiarity itself was a kind of love. Thad Greenwood, young, capable, eager, and steady, was written as a deputy and an extra pair of hands in the Marshall's world, the kind of character who could bring motion and youth into a long-running story, who could stand in a doorway while older legends spoke, who could ride out on an errand that became a lesson, who could absorb the danger and still look like tomorrow might be manageable. And for a stretch of time, roughly 50 episodes from late 1965 into 1967, that was Roger Ewing's face, the clean-cut deputy under a Western hat, a reliable presence that millions recognized without ever needing to know his full name, the kind of recognition that doesn't feel like fame at first because it arrives disguised as routine. In the golden era of network television, that routine could be intoxicating. Calls to set, wardrobe racks, the sharp smell of makeup, the heat of lights, the quiet tension before action, the sudden warmth of a laugh or a compliment, the sense that the world had a place for him and that place came with a script. But a role that large and a show that powerful also carried a shadow. It taught audiences to love an image, and it taught the person inside the image how easy it was to be adored, as long as he kept playing the part. But behind the badge and behind the steady gaze, what was he really building? An identity or a mask? In the mid-1960s, when American television still felt like a single national campfire and the same stories flickered in millions of homes at the same hour, Roger Ewing's life began to run on a schedule measured in call times and camera angles, in boots hitting plywood streets and the heat of studio lamps that made Dodge City feel sunlit even when the real day outside was gray. There is a particular kind of power in being part of something that long-running, something that had already taught a country to trust it, because the show does not simply hire a performer, it absorbs him, it gives him a uniform, a rhythm, a purpose, and then it sends him into the world as an image that people feel they know. Thad Greenwood was young enough to carry the promise of tomorrow inside a town built on yesterday, steady enough to stand beside older, heavier legends without needing to dominate the frame, and useful enough, deputy, helper, the extra set of hands, to slip into storylines like a tool the writers could reach for when the show needed momentum, when the marshal needed someone to send down a dark alley, when danger required a younger body to move first. And for roughly 50 episodes between 1965 and 1967, he did what network television asked him to do, which was not simply act but repeat. Repeat the posture, repeat the confidence, repeat the look that told audiences everything was under control, even when the script was filled with gunfire and grief. It was easy from the outside to mistake that repetition for security. It looked like stability, like a rising career on rails, like the kind of job that could run forever as long as the ratings stayed warm. But repetition has a hidden cost. It trains the audience to love the role, and and it trains the performer to live inside the expectations of a role until the boundary between the two starts to thin, until the public face becomes easier to inhabit than the private one. In that era, fan mail did not arrive as anonymous data points and fleeting likes. It arrived as paper, as handwriting, as envelopes that carried the weight of strangers' affection, telling a person he mattered, telling him he belonged, telling him that his presence on their screen had become part of their week, sometimes part of their family story. And that kind of affection can feel like oxygen, especially for someone still young enough to believe the job is proof of worth. Yet the same thing that lifts a person can also quietly cage him. If the world applauds the badge, the hat, the reliable deputy smile, then what happens on the days when the smile is heavy, when the eyes feel tired, when the body wants to be anything other than reliable? If the set becomes the only place where the identity feels clear, deputy, helper, good man in a dangerous town, then what does the silence feel like when the day wraps and the lights shut off, when the crew goes home, when the streets of Dodge City become plywood again, and the person who is celebrated is suddenly just a man alone with his own thoughts? This is where the first cracks begin, not as scandal, not as a headline, but as a private mismatch between what the world is buying and what the person can afford to sell. Because a long-running show does not merely create fame, it creates a pattern, and patterns become masks, and masks become heavy in ways nobody sees from the couch. And while the public version of Roger Ewing seemed to be moving smoothly through a golden corridor, primetime recognition, a recognizable character, a place inside a television institution, life behind that corridor always contains quieter realities. The industry's constant churn, the way new faces are always arriving, the way writers adjust and reshape, the way a character can be loved and still be replaceable, the way a role can be a home and yet never truly belong to the person wearing it. Inside a machine built to run forever, the individual is still fragile. Every season is a test, every contract a cliff edge, every great job a compliment that never guarantees tomorrow. And the more a person learns that truth, the more the applause begins to sound like something borrowed, something that can be taken back without warning. For a time, he kept moving. Guest spots, other work, the ordinary hustle of a working actor in an era when television could keep you employed and still never truly secure you. But the internal question grows louder. How long can a man keep living as a character before he begins to suffocate under the costume of himself? And if the role that made him visible is also the role that threatens to define him forever, what does escape even look like? In the story that would unfold, the tragedy would not arrive as one explosive catastrophe. It would arrive as a slow, almost invisible turning, a private decision forming in the background while the public still assumed the trajectory was upward, because the most misunderstood kind of collapse is the one that begins as a choice, quiet, deliberate, and terrifyingly alone.
In the early 1970s, when so many careers in Hollywood were trained to treat momentum like a law of nature, one credit becoming the next, one season becoming the next, Roger Ewing did something that confuses people even now because it refuses the usual storyline. He stepped away before the world could watch him fall, before tabloids could narrate a collapse, before the industry could reduce him to a "where is he now" punchline. And the strange thing about leaving the spotlight is that it can look from the outside like disappearing, when in truth it can be a form of self-preservation so quiet that nobody recognizes it as bravery. The exit was not a single dramatic slam of a door, not a public feud, not a scandalous headline, but a gradual turning of the body away from the set, away from the endless audition rooms, away from the pressure to keep being the deputy, the familiar face, the reliable kid with the steady gaze, because the longer that image lived in the public imagination, the more it threatened to become the only language anyone used to speak about him. And that is the moment a role becomes dangerous, not when it is hated, but when it is loved so thoroughly that the person underneath starts to feel like an accessory. The industry is built to reward the mask, and it is built to punish anyone who stops wearing it, because a machine that runs on familiarity does not like uncertainty, and leaving introduces uncertainty. So when the work slowed and the attention drifted, it would have been easy to cling harder, to chase the next part like a man chasing oxygen, to negotiate for relevance, to accept smaller and smaller rooms just to keep hearing applause.
But the tragedy in stories like this is rarely the spectacular kind. It is the slow realization that the applause can become a transaction, that affection can become conditional, that every smile is only valuable as long as it sells the same idea of a person, and that the moment a performer needs tenderness more than attention, the industry has no language for it. So, he chose a different kind of life, one where the world did not stare back, one where looking was something he controlled, photography. It is impossible to miss the symbolism, an actor who spent years being framed by other people's lenses, choosing, instead, to frame the world through his own. In that pivot, the narrative changes from being watched to watching, from being interpreted to interpreting, from performing to observing, and in that shift there is a kind of quiet healing that also carries a hidden loneliness. Because the camera can travel with a person, but it cannot sit across from him at night and ask how he is really doing. The reports of his later passions speak of distance, Mexico, Russia, Europe, the South Pacific, names that sound romantic on paper, but also suggest a mind that preferred horizon to hallway, movement to the stale air of the same stories, the same questions, the same shadow of a character that followed him like a second skin. And yet, even the most beautiful escape has a cost, because the further a person walks from the role the world recognizes, the easier it becomes for the world to stop recognizing the person at all. Later, in Morro Bay, California, the scale of life becomes smaller in a way that is both merciful and unforgiving. No studio lights, no weekly ritual of millions of strangers, just ocean air, local streets, the slow passage of days where the only audience is the self, and the only review that matters is the one written quietly inside the chest at night. It is telling that in 2003, his name surfaced not in entertainment pages, but in local civic life, running for city council, a move that suggests something deeply human, the desire to belong to a real place, to be part of a community that knows a person for more than a character, to trade the artificial town of Dodge City for an actual town where decisions affect neighbors and mornings feel tangible. And still, even in that grounded life, the old paradox remains. The world remembers the character longer than it remembers the man, because characters are designed to be remembered, while human beings are designed to change, to age, to soften, to become quieter, to step away from the version of themselves that once made sense to strangers. That is how a life can begin to narrow without anyone noticing, not because it becomes meaningless, but because it becomes private, and privacy is invisible to the public narrative that fame trained everyone to expect. So, when December 18, 2025 arrived in Morro Bay and the cause of death was not publicly shared, there was no roar outside a hospital, no bank of cameras, no curtain call, just the final fact that all lives eventually become a date, a place, and a silence that does not explain itself. And the real heartbreak is not simply that he died, it is that the distance between the man America watched and the man who lived afterward had grown so wide that the public did not even learn of the ending until weeks later, as if the world needed a reminder that the people it once consumed as entertainment still age, still bleed, still vanish, still leave behind rooms without applause. Was leaving Hollywood the way he saved himself, or the way he slowly let the world forget him? And if a person escapes the spotlight only to be swallowed by silence, is that freedom, or just a different kind of exile? After the decision was made, after the cameras stopped calling, after the name Thad Greenwood became something that lived more in reruns and memory than in new scripts, life did what it always does when the spotlight is gone. It kept moving, without music, without applause, without the clean edits that make a story feel purposeful. The tragedy in careers like this is not that the work ends, it is that the world assumes the person ends with it, as if an actor's value is measured only by how often strangers see him. In Morro Bay, California, the rhythms were no longer dictated by studio schedules, but by ordinary things that never make headlines. The morning air that smells like salt, the slow pace of traffic, the same storefronts, the same faces, the way days can blur together when no one is asking you to perform a version of yourself. For someone who once lived inside the high-pressure repetition of network television, that quiet can feel like relief at first, an unclenching of the jaw, a breath taken without worrying how it reads on camera. But relief has a shadow. Without the structure of production, without the constant external validation, the mind has space to replay old scenes, not the scripted ones, but the private ones that fame never fixed. Moments of doubt, the fear of being replaceable, the strange grief of watching a younger self exist forever on screen while the real body grows older in the mirror. This is where late-life solitude becomes its own kind of set, built out of routines instead of props, built out of repetition that no one applauds, days that begin the same way, meals that taste the same way, evenings that stretch long when the house is quiet and the only sound is something distant, perhaps the wind off the water, perhaps the low hum of a television that is on not for entertainment but for company. The cruel irony is that the man who once helped fill rooms, who once stood in a fictional town where every conflict ended with a lesson and a resolution, now lived in a world where there is no writer to tie a ribbon on the day, no director to call cut on sadness, no audience to tell him he did well just for showing up. In the public imagination, the story of a former television actor is often flattened into a single question: whatever happened to him? As if a life after fame is a punchline or a mystery box. But real lives after fame are rarely dramatic. They are quiet, and in that quiet there can be dignity, but also pain, because being unseen does not always mean being at peace. The reports that he traveled with a camera, that he photographed places far from Hollywood, Mexico, Europe, Russia, the South Pacific, suggest a man who still wanted the world, still wanted light and landscape and motion, but wanted it on his own terms, without the old contract that demanded he be someone for strangers. Photography offers a different kind of control. It lets a person choose what to look at, choose what to preserve, choose what to reveal. And perhaps that was the most honest form of expression he ever found, one where he did not have to speak lines written by someone else, one where he did not have to smile when he didn't feel like smiling. And yet, even that creative life carries the ache of distance, because art can be a companion, but it cannot replace the warmth of being known, truly known, by other human beings. If he ran for city council in 2003, it reads like a small but telling reach outward, a desire to attach his life to something real and local, something that could not be canceled after a season, something that might let neighbors see him as a person instead of a character. But even community cannot erase the deeper paradox of aging in the shadow of an on-screen past. Somewhere out there, a stranger can still turn on a rerun and watch him young, capable, steady under a cowboy hat, while in real time the man himself lived a quieter day, a smaller day, a day no one recorded. That is the strange kind of loneliness fame creates, the split between an immortal image and a mortal body, because one keeps playing forever and the other keeps moving toward an ending that arrives without credits. And when December 18, 2025 came in Morro Bay and the public cause of death remained unspoken, the silence did not just describe how he died, it also described how the world had learned to stop listening. What does it do to a person to know that millions once watched him breathe, and now almost no one knows when he stopped?
In the end, the most haunting part of Roger Ewing's story is not a scandal, not a courtroom, not a public unraveling captured by flashing cameras, but a quieter truth that feels almost harder to bear. The world can love a face, a role, a weekly presence, and still never learn how to love the person inside it. Fame is often described as a kind of power, but for many performers it is closer to a contract, temporary warmth exchanged for a permanent mask, and the longer the mask is worn, the more the skin underneath forgets what it felt like to be unobserved. On screen, he could be steady. The deputy could step into danger. The character could move through conflict with a clear purpose. The story could always resolve by the end of the hour. But real life does not write endings that neatly, and it does not keep characters forever. When the role fades, what remains is whatever was built behind it. Friendships that were real, routines that were grounding, a sense of self that does not require an audience to validate it. If leaving Hollywood was his attempt to reclaim that self, it also reveals the risk of stepping away. The applause may have been a cage, but it was also a kind of proof that he existed in other people's minds, and losing that proof can feel like dissolving. The lesson is not that fame is evil or that privacy is salvation. It is that neither one can substitute for being truly known. A career can make millions recognize a face, but only a handful of relationships can make a life feel held. And when the public learns of a death weeks late through a single obituary line, it forces an uncomfortable question. How many people do we consume as entertainment, then abandon when the show ends? In the end, the applause fades, the reruns keep playing, and the only thing that doesn't fade is the human need for connection, off camera, off script, in the rooms where nobody is watching. Because sometimes the real tragedy isn't that a legend died, it's that he lived long enough to become a memory before he was gone. It circles back to that late-night glow on January 9th, 2026, the small, almost weightless way the news arrived, like a final whisper from a world that once shouted his name without even knowing it. Somewhere in Morro Bay, the ocean kept doing what it has always done, folding and unfolding against the shore with no awareness of credits or careers, no understanding of what it means to be remembered by strangers. And somewhere far away in a different kind of quiet, a television can still be turned on, a rerun can still load, and there he is again, younger, steadier, framed by the fiction of Dodge City, wearing a badge that suggests certainty, stepping into scenes that will never age even as the man who performed them did. That is the strange split fame creates, an immortal version of a person preserved in light, and a mortal version who walks through ordinary days until the ordinary days run out. Roger Ewing's ending did not come with a final monologue or a televised farewell. It came as most endings do, privately, without explanation, without the world being ready. And then it came again weeks later as a public footnote, a paragraph that tried to summarize a whole human being in a few clean lines. If there is a haunting truth to take from this, it is not simply that Hollywood forgets. It is that all of us forget, unless we choose not to. The next time an old face flickers across a screen, the next time a familiar voice returns from decades ago, it is worth remembering that behind that image is a person who had mornings and doubts and loneliness and small joys the camera never caught. Because in the end, the character remembered was half the story. The other half lived off screen, in silence, and ended there.